All right, let's go ahead and get started. Let's put phones away. So on the papers, so if you weren't here last time, we handed back both paper assignments. So I've got those here. You can grab it from me at the end of class. Some of you who were here last time didn't get one or both of them back because you hadn't turned it in both formats. That is a more or less hard and fast rule that I want to stick with. You got to turn them in both formats to get them back. However, and paper if you weren't here last time, paper assignment 2B, the deadline is pushed back to Monday. I wanted everybody to have some feedback from us before they have to write that longer version of the paper. So for folks who had submitted to A on Blackboard as of sometime yesterday, but had not given us a hard copy, we did go ahead and print those and grade them because we wanted you to get some feedback. So you are required to submit it to us in both formats, and usually I will not give you either feedback or a grade until you do. But because you're revising and expanding this paper and it's due Monday and today is the last time I'm going to see you, I wanted you to get the feedback. So we did print a bunch of those. I don't know. It's possible we missed somebody. I think we got them all. The way you'll know. So anyway, I have those with me too. So you can grab that at the end of class. The way you know when I have a paper to hand back to you is if you see a grade posted on Blackboard, then you know it's ready to hand back. And if you don't see a grade posted on Blackboard, it's either because we're not finished with them or because you didn't give it to us in both formats, right? So double check that. So the 5-pager's due on Monday. Questions about that? Okay, so I've said this before, but just to reiterate, 2 goals in this 5-page paper about the Warren Court. 1, come up with an overarching theme that characterizes, in your mind, that accurately characterizes much of what was going on the Supreme Court in the 1960s. There is no one right answer there. There are lots of possible themes. There are some wrong answers, right? You could say a theme that doesn't really seem like it fits at all, but there's lots of good answers, right? Lots of good answers, but you got to come up with one. And some of them are more interesting or significant than others. There's lots of potential good answers, but you come up with something that really seems valuable and worthwhile and interesting and significant to you, right? So that's one goal. And then the second goal is to discuss a lot of the specific things that we've covered in the course so far and connect them to your theme, right? You have to have both of those. To get an A, you got to have both of those, right? A clearly stated theme that fits the historical record, and then some detailed, specific discussion of individual cases in support of the theme. And there's some language in the prompt that says something like, go with what it says on the syllabus, not whatever I say verbally now, in case I mess it up a little bit. But it says something like, we recommend that you reference at least 6 different decisions of the Supreme Court, including direct quotations from at least 3 of them. It says something like that, right? So the point, I'm not too hung up on the numbers, but the point is I want a lot of specifics, right? I want the theme, I want the thesis, overarching theme, that how you're going to characterize the Warren Court era, but then I want lots of specifics in support, right? It's got to include some quotations. Don't overdo it on quotations. Leave room for your own words too, but it's got to include some direct quotations. It's got to include reference to multiple different decisions. Your goal is to be sort of drawing, don't try to talk about everything we've talked about so far, but draw on multiple different things, multiple different Supreme Court decisions that we've talked about so far, and connect them together under one overall theme. Questions? Yeah?
Are we allowed to use any outside cases or only ones we've covered?
You are, you're allowed to use some outside cases. I guess my verb of choice is that I would discourage it, or just say don't do too much of it, right? We've covered a lot of cases so far that are directly relevant to the prompt, and so I want to see some analysis of those cases. If one of the things you're talking about is voting rights, and there was one really significant voting rights case in the 60s that seems like it fits your thesis that we didn't talk about, and you want to add that in, but you've also addressed Baker versus Carr and Reynolds versus Sims, that's fine. In our next big paper assignment due towards the end of the semester, there is potentially more room for doing some outside sources of your own if you're inclined in that direction on that one. That one too, I'll say, make sure you have some analysis of our cases from class, but I'm more flexible on adding some stuff. This one, we've really got so much relevant material just in the required readings. The priority is clear thesis and nice analysis of the relevant material from our course readings. And if you've got both of those already and you still got some time and space and you want to supplement that with one or two additional cases, that's fine. Always, again, I'm not a super stickler on what kind of citation format you use. Parenthetical is fine with a list of references at the end. Footnotes is fine. Endnotes is fine. Pick some respectable format and stick with it. The thing I am a stickler on is a clear indication of where everything is from. So if everything that you're referencing is from our textbook, then just parentheses GGW page 42 is fine because I know what that is. If you are citing some cases that are not in our textbook, then you got to give me a URL or whatever. Tell me where you found them. Okay. I've got office hours right after class today. So, and last time I looked, the appointments were not full. So anybody wants to come by right after class with questions, you can. Okay. So, you guys are still writing about the Warren Court till Monday, but in class we were basically done with the Warren Court era, and we're shifting gears to how constitutional development started to shift in different directions after Earl Warren's tenure on the court. Again, he stepped down in 1969, and I'll say a little bit more about that transition in a minute. First thing, I want to show you a few things up here on the screen just to kind of put you in some context. So the time period we're in right now is the late 1960s, right? 1968 is a presidential election year. These are the presidential election results. I can make that a little bigger, maybe. So if you took on one, you'll remember that we looked at election results like this sometimes to put in context some of what's going on the Supreme Court, but in political context, right? So you'll remember we looked at the 1932 presidential election map. In Con Law 1, that is FDR winning in a historic landslide, and then he ran for re-election in 1936, and it looked like that. Giant Democratic majorities in both houses of Congress. It would be... The Supreme Court is not a directly elected institution, but it would be... It would be surprising if election results like this didn't have some effect on the Supreme Court, right? At the time FDR was elected, he was elected 4 times, by the way, and at the time of his initial election in 1932, it had been a Republican Party that had been mostly control of American politics for decades, right? Not winning every election, but mostly in power. And then FDR wins these gigantic landslides. So let's look again at 1968. Attempt again to make this a little bigger. I'm glad it goes great. All right. Tell me something you notice about these election results from 1968. Yeah.
Blue states are red and red states are blue.
Yeah, okay, so this website which I have been using for a long time, and it's a very nice website with maps of every presidential election in U.S. history. He launched this website before the red state, blue state thing was so blue is Republican here, right? Yeah. Oh, so that's what you're saying. Yeah, gotcha. Yeah, so he uses different colors than we usually use today. So he's using blue to mean Republican, but some of these states are typically Democratic states nowadays. Is that what you're saying? Okay, gotcha. All right. What else do you notice? Yeah.
Third-party candidate won multiple states.
Yeah, there's a bunch of green states. What the heck is that? Right? We got to come up with another color for George Wallace, who ran a populist, racist campaign appealing to mostly white working class voters, mostly in the South, and he won. What is that? Louisiana, Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia. Right? Anything else you notice of note? Yeah, Maurice?
Nixon won California.
Yeah, Nixon won California. So Richard Nixon was from California.
Okay.
But this is notable, right? California is currently a very sadly Democratic state, and prior to this election, had usually been carried by Democrats in recent elections as well. Prior to this election, so I just showed you FDR's maps a second ago, and I said prior to FDR's victories, Republicans had been winning most elections. Again, nobody wins every time, but like in an overall period of American history, there's a period where Republicans are winning most of the time, and then sometimes it shifts and Democrats are winning most of the time. FDR's was a transformation, and this appears to be a transformation back in the other direction, right? From FDR through LBJ, Democrats have been winning most of the elections. And now Richard Nixon wins, and he's got a pretty broad map. And if you look at the popular vote, right, it's very close between him and Hubert Humphrey, right? So that, it's not like a landslide or anything. The popular vote's really close. If you think of Nixon and Wallace together as both conservative candidates, which is accurate, I think, then the popular vote is not so close, right? If you add them together, then they do have a clear majority. Nixon, of course, runs for re-election in 1972. And there's some, right? So like FDR, FDR had kind of landslide both times, but the second time was like a gigantic landslide. Nixon's was close the first time, and then he has this gigantic landslide in 1972, right? For both electoral vote, clearly, like the whole map, except for Massachusetts and D.C., and popular vote, 60%, right? It would be surprising if election results like this had no significant impact on the Supreme Court. Again, we don't get to vote for the Supreme Court justices directly, but it would be surprising if election results like this had no impact. Let me show you a quick slide here. So this is slightly complicated. There's two things going on this slide. The red and blue bars represent the percentage of the national popular vote in presidential elections, and the dotted line and those numbers are over here. And the dotted line represents the number of Republican-appointed Supreme Court justices, and those numbers are over here, right? In 1968, there were 4 Republican-appointed justices on the Supreme Court. Right? Republicans, and we're back to our conventional red and blue here. So red is Republican on this slide. Republicans won, right? Really narrow, right? Nixon had that really narrow popular vote victory, but then a gigantic one 4 years later. Gerald Ford lost to Jimmy Carter, right? But then Reagan got elected twice, and then the first George W. Bush got elected. So Republicans are winning most of these elections, right? 5 out of these 6 presidential elections are won by Republicans. And at the end of the period, you have 8 Republican-appointed Supreme Court justices. That is a more or less normal and recurring feature of the Supreme Court's history. Over any significant span of time, if the broader political system is moving clearly in one particular direction, it is likely that the Supreme Court is going to follow in that same direction, right? If Republicans are winning almost all of the presidential elections, then probably the court is going to move in a more conservative direction, right? The presidents nominate the justices. The Senate has to confirm them, right? But if you got more Republican presidents and more Republican senators, you are probably going to wind up with more conservative Supreme Court justices over time. That doesn't tell us anything about exactly how the court's going to decide any particular case, but it is a broad context, right? So one of our major themes for the remainder of the semester is going to be, what did Republican presidents want the Supreme Court to be doing, and did it do it? Right? What was the vision of Republican presidents for the Supreme Court and the Constitution? What did they think was wrong with the earlier stuff that the court was doing? And what were they proposing to do differently? What kind of justices did they appoint? What did those justices then do on the court? Right? And to start this conversation, one more thing to show you. So I want us to look at a couple campaign commercials from 1968. So this is another nice website. So let's start with George Wallace. So again, George Wallace ran a third-party campaign, appealing, making populist appeals to mostly white Southern voters. And here's one of his campaign commercials. Try a different browser on this one too. Here. Oh, here we go.
Wallace, follow as your children are bused across town.
As President, I shall, within the law, turn back the absolute control of the public school systems to the people of the respective states.
Why are more and more millions of Americans turning to Governor Wallace? Take a walk in your street or park tonight.
As President, I shall help make it possible for you and your families to walk the streets of our cities in safety.
Why are more and more millions of Americans turning to Governor Wallace? Watch your hard-earned tax dollars sail away to anti-American countries.
As President, I will halt the giveaway of your American dollars and products to those nations that aid our enemies.
Wallace has the courage to stand up for America. Give him your support.
That's George Wallace. Let's try something from Richard Nixon here. He's got a bunch. Let's try this one.
It is time for an honest look at the problem of order in the United States. Dissent is a necessary ingredient of change. But in a system of government that provides for peaceful change, there is no cause that justifies resort to violence. Let us recognize that the first civil right of every American is to be free from domestic violence. So I pledge to you, we shall have order in the United States.
Show another Nixon one here.
In recent years, crime in this country has grown 9 times as fast as population. At the current rate, the crimes of violence in America will double by 1972. We cannot accept that kind of future for America. We owe it to the decent and law-abiding citizens of America to take the offensive against the criminal forces that threaten their peace and their security, and to rebuild respect for law across this country. I pledge to you, the wave of crime is not going to be the wave of the future in America.
And I want to show you one from 1972 also. So those were from 68, Nixon's first election. He runs for re-election in 72.
Massive busing produces inferior education, and education is the name of the game.
President Nixon believes busing is wrong, and he intends to do something about it.
I mean, busing, when it's used in a massive way, is bad. But when you take kindergarten kids and put them on a bus for an hour and a half, when they got a school they could walk to 5 minutes away, well, that's wrong. It's wrong for the white children. It's wrong for the black children. They will have the effect of creating hatreds among the kids. Their lives should not be experimented with. Their education should not be affected in a detrimental way. That's what the busing is all about.
There's still much to be done to improve the education of all of our children. This is why we need President Nixon now more than ever.
The rest of them are all worth watching too, and I put the URL on your handout if you want to check some of them out. What'd you get from those commercials about what's going on in political debate in 1968 and 72?
A lot of fear involved.
For sure, a lot of fear, right? Images of crime, descriptions of violent crime. Yeah.
He kind of campaigned against some of the Supreme Court decisions. Like that last one was about buses, which that was big in Brown because the black students had to travel to get to the better schools, and the I feel like criminal forces was mentioned in that. Criminal forces versus peace forces.
And one of them even had an image of Chief Justice Warren, brief image passed by him. So yes, for sure, some references. There's some direct, some a little bit more indirect to the Supreme Court, right? And as I mentioned at the end of class last time, in some of his campaign speeches, Nixon would directly criticize some of the decisions of the Supreme Court. Check.
School is still like a major issue, even a decade after Brown decision. So
that's right.
It kind of shows how important that was.
Right, and that last commercial was actually from 1972, so that's almost 20 years after Brown, right? That's 18 years after Brown versus Board of Education, and there is significant political controversy over whether and how the courts should be trying to implement Brown versus Board of Education in certain ways, and what impact that's having on schools. Marcus?
Seems like social movements are portrayed to be lawless,
Yeah.
and not as purposeful and strategic as they actually were.
Yeah.
And that order is essential, or the I guess greatest priority after that sort of time period.
The modern Republican Party came to power in part by denouncing left liberal social movements. Right around the same time, Ronald Reagan gets elected governor of California, and in Reagan's first Reagan was a Hollywood actor, before that who had never run for political office. I'm trying to remember the time sequence here. There's one famous, he's a Hollywood actor, and he gives a famous televised speech supporting Richard Nixon, maybe in like 66, 67, somewhere around there. And then he runs for governor of California himself, maybe 68, I forget which year. But Reagan, too, in his speeches back then, he would denounce, there were famous like student organizing efforts in California, right? The free speech movement on the campus at University of California at Berkeley. Reagan gets elected in part by going on TV over and over again and denouncing the like lawless college students who are like disrupting classes and refusing to do what they're supposed to do, and Nixon's doing the same thing, right? Images suggesting that social protest has gone too far and is like lawless and disruptive of the good order of society, and we need to reclaim law and order and reestablish order. Yeah. Anything else from those ads? So a couple things to say. So Nixon wins in 68 and 72. He then, of course, has to resign from office because of the Watergate scandal, which is something we'll talk about. And in part because of the wake of Watergate, the Democrats win the 76 election. But then the Republicans win 3 in a row, again, 1980, 84, and 88, Reagan, and Bush. Then Bill Clinton wins and serves 2 terms for the Democrats again. Then the second Bush comes in, George W. Bush, and he wins 2, right? And then Obama wins 2 terms. And then Trump, of course, wins in 2016. So, again, in the period from 1968 until now, it is not the case that Republicans win every election, right? But as political scientists would characterize it, it is overall a Republican era, right? Yeah, you don't want to overstate that. Like, what does that mean exactly? When exactly does the era start and when does it end? The way some political scientists would say it is during 68 and 72, we were still kind of in the tail end of the Democratic era. We still had Democratic majorities in both houses of Congress. But Nixon manages to win election anyway. And maybe with Reagan's election in 1980, which I could have shown you that map too, Reagan wins a big victory in 80 and then an even bigger one in 84. Now we're really full-fledged in the Republican era. So don't overthink it, right? Don't there's no like exact signposts that say we have left the Democratic era, now we're in a Republican era. But over time, right, over the broad period of time from 1968 to the present, we have more Republican victories in national elections than we were having during the previous period, right? And so again, one of our themes for the remainder of the semester is to think about, well, what did these Republican presidents want to happen with the Supreme Court and the Constitution? And I'll give you some examples. So one thing Nixon emphasized a lot, which had constitutional implications, was law and order. Nixon's standard stump speech, his campaign speech in 1968, he would say, in the past 45 minutes, this is what happened in America. There has been 1 murder, 2 rapes, 45 major crimes of violence, countless robberies, and auto thefts. He repeatedly declared that it was the Warren Court's criminal procedure decisions that were in part responsible for this outbreak of violent crime. And he said these decisions have had the effect of seriously hamstringing the peace forces in our society and strengthening the criminal forces. George Wallace, right, who again ran in the same election, here's what he would say in his stump speech. If you walk out of this hotel tonight and someone knocks you on the head, he'll be out of jail before you're out of the hospital, and on Monday morning they'll try the policeman instead of the criminal. That's what Wallace would say over and over again on the campaign trail. So there is clearly, from 2 presidential candidates, there is clearly emphasis on law and order and blame being directed at the Supreme Court for the decline of law and order. Decisions like Miranda versus Arizona are siding with criminals and letting them go free on technicalities and contributing to a breakdown in law and order. Nixon says that over and over again. You can see echoes of this in Republican political candidates today, right? I mean, Trump gave a widely noted speech last August to a group of law enforcement officials in Long Island in which he encouraged them to physically mistreat arrested suspects. He said, "Don't be too nice." That's a direct quote. He said, "You know that thing that you see on TV where you put your hand on the top of their head when you're pushing them into the squad car so they don't bump their head?" He's like, "Why do you do that? Stop! Don't do that." So echoes of these same law and order ideas from Nixon and Wallace. Another thing we see in these commercials, in these campaign ads from then is, how do I want to say this, narrow support for civil rights at best, right? For George Wallace, I would say opposition to civil rights. He is opposed to Brown versus Board of Education. For Nixon, it's a little more nuanced. Nixon is supportive of Brown versus Board of Education, and he just argues that civil rights have been carried too far. Right? Brown versus Board of Education, that was right. I agreed with that one. But the way judges now are forcing kids to be bussed across town in an effort to, like, not just implement Brown, but make sure we have, like, the exact same percentage of kids of different races at every school, which is overstating what was actually happening, but that's how he would describe it. He's like, that's going too far, right? We want kids to be able to go to the school that's nearest to their house, as long as nobody's, like, directly discriminating against anybody else, right? If you jump forward to the Reagan era, in the 80s, Reagan and the officials that he appointed in the Justice Department devoted a lot of efforts to trying to limit and curtail affirmative action programs, which is another issue that we'll talk about, right? So in the wake of Brown and the Civil Rights Movement, a variety of governmental policies develop in which various governmental institutions will consider people's race in an effort not to discriminate against a previously oppressed group, but to try to ameliorate the condition of that previously oppressed group. And Republican presidents, especially Reagan on this one, spent a lot of time criticizing those policies, right? And that has potential constitutional dimension too, right? What does the 14th Amendment require, and what does it not require? Again, for every one of these kind of, what I'm trying to put on the board is a list of conservative ideas that emerge from Republican political candidates, especially Republican presidents, that have some potential impact on how we think of the Constitution. And all of the, I think everything that we put on the board it's still relevant today, right? So, and maybe for most or all of them, one reading of what our current president is doing is acting on these same ideas but carrying them to a further extreme, right? So Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan never publicly condoned, like, white supremacist rallies, right? That's Trump's thing, right? So it's connected in a way, but it's carrying it way further. There were many good people at that rally in Charlottesville, right? That is going further than Reagan did on racial conservatism. Okay, but you can see how it fits together. All right, another one. We didn't really get this in those commercials. This one gets bigger in Reagan's years. This gets bigger in the 80s, but there are some early signs of it under Nixon, and that is social and religious conservatism, right? So traditional moral values, religious right, Christian conservatism, whatever label you want to put on that. This has clear implications for lots of constitutional issues. The one that Nixon talked about the most was pornography. right? The Warren Court had issued some decisions extending free speech protection to obscene speech, and Richard Nixon criticized those decisions. He's like, well, we don't need more pornography in our society. What is that? Why is the court doing that? Right? But over time, over the course of the 70s and into the 1980s, this gets extended to a criticism of a wide range of like socially liberal Supreme Court decisions, right? The decisions about school prayer, for example, right? Why is the Supreme Court trying to kick God out of the schools? President Reagan repeatedly criticizes the school prayer decisions. And the biggest example is abortion, right? So 1973 Roe versus Wade decision, so that there's no commercials about abortion from here because we were watching commercials from 1968 and 72. Roe versus Wade is 1973. It's not immediately a huge issue in American politics when that decision comes down, but it is an issue from the beginning, and Nixon does criticize it, right? Nixon criticizes Roe versus Wade when it comes down, and then by the 1980s, it's a huge front page issue over and over and over again, and President Reagan in particular repeatedly criticizes Roe versus Wade, and he repeatedly orders his Justice Department to try to persuade the Supreme Court to reverse Roe versus Wade. This one you can still see connections to, and obviously in Republican Party advocacy today. I mean, Trump is an unusual standard bearer for traditional moral values, and there's been a lot of consternation in the press about like why do Christian conservatives support Trump so strongly, but in the polls suggest that they do, right? White evangelicals, right? Not black and Latino Christians, right? But white evangelicals in public opinion polls still support Trump quite strongly. It has gone down over the past year, but it's still pretty robust. And Trump, though he himself does not seem to fit these values particularly smoothly, right? He has expressed support for them, right, as a candidate, and since being elected, Trump has said he thinks Roe versus Wade was wrong and should be overturned. He has said, I'm going to appoint judges who are going to overturn it. He has appointed one Supreme Court Justice, Neil Gorsuch, and a number of lower court judges who have not publicly said anything one way or the other about their views on Roe versus Wade, but who have adopted views of the Constitution under which it seems like they might rule against Roe versus Wade, right? That would be consistent with their views. So again, this is a continuing part of Republican Party ideas about what the court and the Constitution are supposed to look like. Another one. I think the best phrase for this is limited government, but in some versions, the right phrase for it might be libertarianism, right? Not all Republicans carry it that far, right? There's a third party called the Libertarian Party that exists because they don't think the Republicans are libertarian enough. But all Republicans since Nixon have made some kind of arguments about the limited scope of governmental power. These arguments are usually directed against the federal government, right? And so they tie in to constitutional principles regarding federalism, right? The idea, right, that from the beginning our Constitution is supposed to give some powers to the national government and reserve other powers for the states, and the court's job, one of the court's jobs is to try to police that line, and sometimes the national government might try to go too far and exercise control over certain things that don't really belong to the national government, that are supposed to be in the state's authority, in which case the Supreme Court's job would be to push back, right? Nixon voiced these themes, and Reagan voiced them even more, and Trump has voiced them too. For both Reagan and George W. Bush, their most significant legislative accomplishments included major tax cuts. And the same is true for President Trump. His most significant legislative accomplishment so far is a major tax cut bill. And that's like a policy issue that's not directly about the Constitution. Like, there's not that many constitutional arguments about how high federal taxes should be. There were 19th century constitutional arguments about whether the income tax was allowed at all. But nowadays, there are not really constitutional arguments about how high federal taxes should be, but it's connected to broader constitutional concerns, because one of the reasons why Republicans have argued for massive federal tax cuts is that they believe the size and scope of the federal government should be smaller. So if we reduce the amount of revenue that is available to it, there will be less things that it is able to do. And another way in which these same Republican leaders have tried to limit the size and scope of the federal government is by going to court and arguing that the federal government is doing some things that it's not constitutionally allowed to do. Right? This regulation of guns, or schools, or violence against women, I'm thinking of examples from real cases, right, exceeds the scope of federal power under the Constitution. Right? It's regulating things that should properly be regulated by the states. All right? So one line, famous quote from Reagan that's on the top of your handout. In his inaugural address in 1981, he said, "Government is not the solution to our problems. Government is the problem." That's like an encapsulation of this component of Republican Party ideology. And Bill Clinton, who's a Democratic president, obviously, Bill Clinton issued a famous speech in the 90s in which he said the era of big government is over, right? So even Democratic presidents during this period are to some extent saying that the size and scope of the federal government needs to be reduced. And the Trump administration, I think the best indication of how these ideas are still relevant for the Republican coalition today is there's the tax cut bill, so that's one issue. But also, if you look like at Trump's cabinet, the people that Trump chose to lead the various agencies of the federal government, whatever you think of them, whether you agree with their agendas or disagree with them, one of the things that is striking about them, right, so there was the quote from Steve Bannon last February in which he said what all these nominees have in common is they're committed to deconstructing the administrative state. And one of the things that's notable about so many of these nominees is that they are opposed. Prior to their nomination, they were publicly opposed to the mission of the agency that they were now being nominated to lead. Betsy DeVos is on record for many years as being opposed to public schools. She doesn't believe in them. Rick Perry, Secretary of Energy, is on record for many years calling for the Department of Energy to be abolished, when he could remember which one it was. When he ran for president, he called for 3 government agencies to be abolished, but then they asked him in a debate, and he could only remember 2 of them. Ben Carson does not believe in public housing, and he is the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. Scott Pruitt is a climate change denier, whose prior career consisted of suing the EPA. He is the head of the EPA, right? So again, lots of people agree with the agendas of those folks, but it is striking, right? It is striking evidence of this strain of Republican Party thinking, right? That we are trying to reduce the size and scope of the federal government because we don't believe in the mission that many parts of the federal government are pursuing. And one of the ways we're going to try to reduce that scope is via the courts. Right? Another idea that you hear from Republican presidents a lot. So these, I'm going to say these are like, I'm going to start a different list. These are like categories of different kinds of political and legal debates, all of which we're going to look at more, right? And they are debates that are sometimes just straightforward political and policy debates that are going on with the president and Congress, but they are sometimes debates that have something to do with the Constitution, and so the court gets drawn in too. right? So debates about the rights of criminal defendants, right? Congress might pass new laws imposing tougher sentences on drug crimes, right? And the courts might issue new decisions cutting back on some of the rights of criminal defendants. Those are two different kinds of things happening, but they're related to each other, right? They're part of the same overall political movement. Now I want to start a second list here of just a couple sort of key ideas about the court that Republican presidents expressed support for that potentially apply to all of these categories, right? So judicial restraint and originalism, these are two different things. They are sometimes linked together, but they don't mean the same thing, and they don't always fit smoothly together. But they are both ideas that Republican presidents from Nixon through Trump have repeatedly advocated. Right? So judicial restraint is something we've talked about. Right? Judicial restraint is the idea that the court should exercise its power cautiously. Not that the court should go away and never do anything, although some people carry it pretty far, it gets close to that. But that the court, the power that the court has to strike down a law that was enacted by other institutions of government, that power is a really significant power that is potentially undemocratic. Right? If we vote for our representatives to Congress and they vote to enact a law and then the court strikes that law down, that sounds undemocratic. And so it's not that the court should never do that. We know part of the point of the Constitution is that the court's supposed to do that sometimes. But the court should be cautious. The court should exercise that power with self-restraint. The first justice to use this phrase was Justice Stone, and the way that he said it was judicial self-restraint. Right? The court should be cautious in exercising the power of judicial review. And Republican presidents like Nixon and Reagan repeatedly made arguments along those lines. I'm going to appoint judges who aren't just trying to make up stuff and impose their own will on the country. They're really just going to stick to the Constitution and only exercise judicial review when it's absolutely necessary to do so. All right? Second kind of argument that you hear from these same presidents is that the Constitution's meaning should be fixed and unchanging, and that the goal of the Supreme Court when deciding a constitutional case should be to figure out what the relevant words from the relevant provision of the Constitution, what did they originally mean? Right? So if we're trying to figure out whether some particular right is included within the 14th Amendment, we're trying to figure out what those words in the 14th Amendment meant in 1868 when they adopted it. If we're trying to figure out whether some particular federal law is consistent with congressional authority under Article 1, Section 8 and the Commerce Clause, we're trying to figure out what those words meant when the framers wrote them in 1787. Right? The meaning of the Constitution doesn't change. It's fixed. One of Reagan's attorney generals, in Reagan's second term, his attorney general was Ed Meese. And Ed Meese gave a series of, at the time, widely noted speeches around the country. There's a quote from one of them on the handout, in which he made the case, this originalist case. So you can take a quick look at that quote. So, presidents have lots of ways to influence the Constitution. I think there are three that are most important, and I'm going to mostly talk about one of them today. But Mises' quote kind of illustrates the other two, which is one reason I like it. So, one way that presidents and their advisors can influence the Constitution is just by public persuasion, right? The president has a platform, and his advisors have a platform. They can give speeches, they can get on TV, people pay attention, and so if we just argue publicly for an originalist approach to the Constitution, we might be able to persuade the American people that this is the best way, right? So just public persuasion. And so Attorney General Ed Meese is giving a speech here on behalf of the Reagan administration, making the case. A second way that the president can influence the Constitution is via litigation. Right? The federal government engages in lots of litigation. Right? That is one of the things that the Department of Justice does. The Solicitor General of the United States, who's the third-ranking official in the Department of Justice, participates in lots of cases at the Supreme Court. Right? Filing written arguments and then participating in oral arguments. Meese talks about that here too. Right? Look how the quote starts. In the cases that we file and those we join as amicus, that's Latin for friend, that is a term meaning somebody who is not an official party to the case, but is allowed to enter into the case and express their views, and the U.S. government does that a lot. In the cases we file and those we join as amicus, we will endeavor to resurrect the original meaning of constitutional provisions as the only reliable guide for judgment. Right? When we, and this guy, the Attorney General, he's in charge of the Justice Department. When we file arguments in the Supreme Court, we are going to argue for the original meaning of the Constitution. We can't tell the court what to do. We can't make them do something, but that's going to be our argument. Right? We are going to say you should not protect abortion rights because they were not protected under the original meaning of the 14th Amendment. Right? So, public persuasion, concrete litigation in specific cases, and then a third major way that the president can try to influence the court and the Constitution is by judicial appointments. Right? The president gets to choose who the new justices are going to be. You wouldn't have to use that as a way to try to change the meaning of the Constitution, but you for sure can use it to try to change the meaning of the Constitution. And under Ed Meese, under Attorney General Ed Meese in Reagan's second term in particular, Nixon did some of this before, Reagan did some of it in his first term, but particularly under Ed Meese during Reagan's second term, there was a very coordinated, concerted effort in the Justice Department to say, let's really look as thoroughly as we can at all the possible nominees for all these different vacancies, and let's really do what we can to try to come up with ideologically conservative judges who are going to decide cases consistently with our vision of all these things on the board. Does that make sense so far? So let's talk about judicial appointments. In June of 1968, Robert Kennedy was assassinated. Robert Kennedy is the former president's brother, who had also been assassinated, and he himself was running for president. He was seeking the Democratic nomination, which he was likely to get. And he was assassinated in California. And this was just a couple months after Dr. King had been assassinated. Right? Horrible, horrible, horrible time for the country. And one impact of Robert Kennedy's assassination was that it led people to start to conclude that Richard Nixon was going to win the election in November. Right? Some people thought Robert Kennedy was going to be the next president. He was going to get the Democratic nomination, and then he was going to win in November. Chief Justice Earl Warren, who was himself a Republican, he had been the Republican governor of California and had been appointed to the court by President Eisenhower. But Chief Justice Earl Warren was not a big fan of Richard Nixon, and he concluded that Richard Nixon was going to win the election. And he decided to go ahead and step down. Shortly after Kennedy's assassination, Warren announced that he was retiring. So this is June of an election year. And President Johnson announced that he was nominating Abe Fortas, same guy who litigated the Gideon versus Wainwright case, who Johnson had appointed to the Supreme Court a couple years earlier. So he was a sitting justice on the Supreme Court. I'm going to promote Justice Fortas to Chief Justice. Whenever the Chief Justice steps down, presidents can either promote one of the sitting justices or they can nominate somebody new. Presidents have done it both ways. Johnson says, I'm going to promote Justice Fortas to Chief, and I'm going to nominate Homer Thornberry, who is a federal court judge on the Fifth Circuit. I'm going to nominate him to take Fortas's seat. One of the reasons why presidents sometimes decide to just nominate a new person into the Chief Justice, which is what George W. Bush did with John Roberts, is then you only have one confirmation hearing, right? If you nominate two people, you got to have a confirmation hearing for Fortas to get approved for Chief Justice, then you got to have another confirmation hearing for Thornberry to get approved, and neither of those things went smoothly. Fortas and Thornberry were both perceived as cronies of Lyndon Johnson, right? They were friends of his. They hung out. And the timing of his retirement was perceived as political, an effort to make sure the current president gets to replace me before we have this election. And so Nixon, on the campaign trail, started saying, what are you doing? No, you can't do any of that. Hold up, stop, pause. Next president should get to fill this vacancy, right? Let the American people weigh in, and then we'll fill it. This is a similar historical precedent to what happened in our recent election, when there was a vacancy about a year before the election that the Republican Senate refused to let the sitting president fill. So we had a Democratic Senate at the time, but there was a substantial Republican minority, and they filibustered successfully Fortas's nomination. And during the hearings, they asked him all kinds of... Here's another political challenge. If you nominate a sitting Supreme Court justice to be Chief Justice, the senators are going to ask him about all kinds of recent decisions issued by the Supreme Court itself that he participated in. Right? If they're a lower court judge, you can ask them about those decisions too, but nobody's ever heard of those ones. Right? In Fortas's hearings, they were asking him about Miranda versus Arizona. And they were asking him about the court's recent pornography decisions. They were asking him about trying to weigh in on why the court was siding with criminals and pornographers and the like. Meanwhile, while the nomination is pending in the Senate, somebody digs up some dirt on Fortas. He had accepted some shady financial payments from somebody. He had been a high-priced corporate lawyer in D.C. before he was nominated to the Supreme Court, and he took a substantial salary cut to join the Supreme Court, and apparently was given doing some no-show jobs for somebody while he was on the Supreme Court. He was given he gave a speech or something, but they paid him a crazy amount of money for it. Anyway, it was something shady that whether it directly violated any ethics rules or not, it looked bad, and he was pressured into resigning. So now not only is LBJ not replacing Chief Justice Warren, now there are two vacancies on the court. Right? Warren is stepping down, and Fortas is stepping down, and Nixon wins the election, and Nixon fills both those vacancies. To replace Chief Justice Warren, Nixon nominates Warren Burger, who was a sitting federal judge in D.C., on the D.C. Circuit, and he had come to public attention because he had given a speech in 1967 in which he complained that Miranda versus Arizona and other recent Supreme Court decisions had made it, quote, often very difficult to convict even those who are patently guilty. This was a weird thing to do, right? Judges give speeches sometimes, and they talk about Marbury versus Madison and stuff, right? But judges do not usually give speeches. Sitting judges do not usually give speeches in which they directly criticize recent decisions of the Supreme Court. And that is what Warren Burger had done. and it got Richard Nixon's attention, and Richard Nixon nominated him to replace Earl Warren. So we know, at least on Miranda and stuff, we know this guy's going to have different views. He was just giving speeches about it. To replace Fortas, Nixon nominates a guy named Clement Haynesworth, who you've never heard of, who gets rejected by the Senate. And Nixon then nominates a guy named Harold Carswell, who you've never heard of, who also gets rejected by the Senate. There was a Democratic Senate. Haynesworth and Carswell were both perceived by Democratic senators as too ideologically conservative. Carswell was also perceived as unqualified, just undistinguished legal and judicial career. So they both get rejected, and then Nixon nominates Harry Blackmun, right, who gets confirmed. He is also a conservative Republican, sitting federal judge, but he's perceived as more moderate, and the Senate confirms him. Blackmun, of course, is the author of Roe versus Wade a couple years later. In the fall of 1971, Justice Harlan and Justice Black both have severe health problems right around the same time. They've both been on the court for some time. They're both getting old. They both have to step down right around the same time. And Nixon replaces them with Lewis Powell, who was the general counsel of the Chamber of Commerce, U.S. Chamber of Commerce, interest group representing for-profit corporations, and William Rehnquist, who was a young, ideologically conservative lawyer in the Justice Department. Famous story from all the Nixon tapes. Nixon recorded all these Oval Office conversations, and historians go back and listen to them all now, and Nixon could never remember Rehnquist's name. He always called him Wrenchberg, and he always complained about Rehnquist's outfits. If you look at pictures of Rehnquist from back then, he's got these like crazy sideburns, and he would wear these like insane like wide ties and stuff with like crazy colors. It's always like, what is the deal with that Wrenchberg guy? What is up with that tie? It's like, that's the guy we're nominating? And they'd be like, yep, he's really good. He's like, all right. It's all recorded. So Rehnquist and Powell are both committed conservatives, as far as people know at the time as well. Nixon gets reelected in 1972, but then has to resign before that term is completed, and Vice President Gerald Ford becomes president. And Justice Douglas, the longest-serving justice in the court's history, appointed by FDR, Justice Douglas retires, and Ford replaces him with John Paul Stevens, another sitting conservative federal judge. Then Jimmy Carter wins, and here's one of the weird things about the structure of the Supreme Court appointment process in our system. It's not like regularized in any way. So some presidents get to appoint some, and some don't. Jimmy Carter serves 4 years. Nixon served 4 years plus a little more, and he appointed 4 justices. And then the guy who finished out his term appointed another one. Carter serves 4 years and appoints nobody. There are no vacancies from 76 to 80. And then Reagan gets elected. On the campaign trail in 1980, Reagan promised that if I am elected, I will appoint the first female justice. Consultants were telling him he was having trouble appealing to women voters. There was a gender gap in the electorate that had emerged where women were more likely to support Democrats and men were more likely to support Republicans. That gender gap still exists to this day. And one of Reagan's efforts to try to address that was to promise to appoint the first female justice. And then in 1981, he gets a vacancy, and he and his advisors at the Justice Department actually had a hard time coming up with a nominee who was female with the requisite qualifications and experience to serve on the Supreme Court and conservative enough to be acceptable to a Republican administration. There were not that many, right? The federal judiciary was almost all male at the time, right? Most Supreme Court justices are lower federal court judges first. Those are like almost all men, right? And the few women that there were had all been appointed by Jimmy Carter, right? We don't want any of them, right? Justice O'Connor was a state court judge in Arizona who literally nobody had ever heard of, outside of Arizona, complete unknown. Nobody knew who she was, right? But she was a Republican, she's conservative, she's a judge, she's qualified to be on the Supreme Court, we're going with her, right? Sandra Day O'Connor. Reagan gets elected gets reelected in 84, and in 86, Chief Justice Burger retires. And Reagan says, I'm going to do what LBJ tried to do. I'm going to promote William Rehnquist. He's already been on the court for like 15 years. I'm going to promote him to Chief Justice. We're going to get him confirmed. And then I'm going to nominate Antonin Scalia to take that seat. Antonin Scalia was a sitting federal judge in D.C. with a very conservative judicial record. Scalia had himself worked in both the Nixon and Reagan administrations, and he had been a law professor at University of Chicago. But at the time, he was a sitting federal judge in D.C. with a very conservative voting record. And both of them get confirmed. In the 1986 midterm elections, Democrats recapture the Senate. In 86, when Rehnquist and Scalia are confirmed, and in 81, when O'Connor's confirmed, there's a Republican Senate, Republican president, Republican Senate. 86, Democrats recapture the Senate. 87, Lewis Powell announces his retirement. Remember, that's one of Nixon's appointees. Lewis Powell says he's retiring. And at the time, in 1987, Lewis Powell was the court's swing justice. The way Justice Kennedy is often described today, if you line the justices up in order, which of course is an oversimplification, but like, are some of them more liberal and some of them more conservative than each other? Yes, that is mostly true on certain kinds of issues. And if you line them up more or less in order, and if there's like 4 pretty conservative guys and 4 pretty liberal ones, and who's the person in the middle, that person is going to sometimes have the deciding vote, right? Kennedy is often described that way, right? The current Supreme Court has 5 Republican appointees and 4 Democratic appointees, but Kennedy is on most issues the least conservative of the Republican appointees. So if he votes with the liberals, then you have a 5-4 liberal outcome, and if he votes with the other conservatives, you have a 5-4 conservative outcome. That's the role that Powell was in the 1980s, including on abortion. Right? Roe versus Wade was 7-2, but by 1987, the Supreme Court's abortion decisions were often issued by 5-4 votes, with Powell in the liberal majority. So this is seen as a high-stakes vacancy. And Reagan nominates Robert Bork. The previous year, when Reagan nominated Scalia, the 2 finalists were Scalia and Bork. Right? They were both sitting federal judges on the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals. They were both very conservative. They were both very qualified to serve on the Supreme Court, distinguished academic and legal and judicial careers. And they went with Scalia, and a lot of people assumed that Bork would get the next. If there was another vacancy, he would get the next one. Scalia was confirmed unanimously, and Bork was rejected. A main reason for that, 2 main reasons. There was a Republican Senate in 1986, and there was a Democratic Senate in 1987. Second reason, Scalia was replacing Rehnquist, who was replacing Berger, both of whom were already very conservative. So his nomination didn't seem like it was going to change the balance of power on the court. Bork would now be replacing Powell, who's the swing justice. If Justice Kennedy decides to retire this year, right? There was an article in the Times over the weekend about speculation. There's been speculation about when he's getting pretty old. When's he going to decide to retire? If Kennedy decides to retire this year, it will be a huge political conflict over replacing him, partly because his current vote is seen as so essential on so many issues. That was how Powell's vote was in the 80s. And then the other reason Bork gets rejected, so those first 2 are like not his fault, right? It's a Democratic Senate, and the vacancy he's being nominated for is a really important one. Those 2 aren't really his fault. This one is maybe partly Bork's fault, if that's the right word. So Bork and Scalia were both very conservative, right? If you looked at their judicial voting records on the lower court, they were similar. And both of them had been law professors before being judges, which means that they both had published stuff. Right? That's one of the things that professors do, is you publish research. And if you're a law professor writing about constitutional law, some of the stuff you publish on is politically controversial. And so both Scalia and Bork had a long record of published writings, but some of Bork's, I don't know if extreme is the right word, they were more controversial, they were on more hot-button topics, maybe, than Scalia's. They drew more attention. And at the confirmation hearings, when Democratic senators tried to ask Bork questions about them, he doubled down. He wouldn't back away from anything. He wasn't ducking the questions, right? He was like a Yale law professor. He's got lots to say, right? He was trying to argue back with them about his vision of the Constitution, which included some ideas that Democratic senators found simply unacceptable. The one that probably got the most attention is that Bork repeatedly said that Griswold versus Connecticut was wrongly decided, which is not an unreasonable thing for a lawyer or a judge to say as a matter of theory, right? Remember, Justice Black dissented in the case. Justice Black's I like privacy. Yeah, privacy's awesome. This is a stupid law. Really? Married couples not allowed to use contraceptives in their own house? What is the deal with that? But there's nothing in the constitutional text that prohibits it. Bork was basically just trying to say the same thing as Black, right? There's nothing in the constitutional text. Bork is an advocate of originalism. And there is nothing in the constitutional text that expressly protects a right to privacy. And so I'm not protected it. It's not in there. That is a perfectly legitimate legal argument. But politically, in 1987, it means he was saying over and over and over again that the government is entitled to bust into a married couple's bedroom and arrest them for using contraceptives. That is the practical implication of what he was saying, and that's what the senators kept asking him over and over again. That wasn't the only issue. There were some issues about civil rights and a bunch of other stuff, but that was a big one. And Senator Edward Kennedy, who was one of the leaders of the Democrats at the time, gave a famous speech just denouncing Bork's vision of the Constitution as extreme and outside the acceptable bounds of mainstream acceptable constitutional argument. And the Senate rejects him. Reagan nominated another very conservative judge when Bork got rejected, named Doug Ginsburg, who you might never have heard of, because he withdrew his nomination after a couple weeks when it came out that he had been smoking weed with his students at Harvard Law School, recently, not a long time ago, but recently, and is that a good reason to keep somebody off the Supreme Court? I don't know. It is illegal, right? And so he was being nominated by a president who was famous for his war on drugs, right? So there's that tension. So Douglas Ginsburg withdraws. And it was also kind of I don't know what the right word for this is. So Bork gets rejected as too extreme. Douglas Ginsburg, the way Democrats described him, he was just as extreme as Bork. He was very, very conservative also, and in some ways was almost, I think, like a protege of Bork's. And he was 20 years younger than Bork. So they're that's even worse. What are you doing? But he withdraws because of, the Democrats never have to do anything because he withdraws. And then Reagan nominates Anthony Kennedy, who is a conservative, sitting federal judge, Republican, lifelong Republican, in California, but is perceived as a more moderate conservative than Robert Bork. And remember, this is to replace Powell, who has the deciding vote on Roe versus Wade. Everybody is 100% confident that Robert Bork would have voted to reverse Roe versus Wade. Kennedy winds up voting to affirm it. Right? So that is notable. This is now the second example in this era of a president having to resort to his third choice. Right? Presidents have a lot of mechanisms to influence the court, but they don't always get to do exactly what they wanted. Right? Clement Haynsworth and Harold Carswell are not on the court. Robert Bork and Douglas Ginsburg are not on the court. And the third choices might not agree with them on everything. Right? George Bush, the first one, George H.W. Bush, gets elected in 1988. While he's president, William Brennan and Thurgood Marshall, who are like the two leading liberal justices on the court, who they're both in their 80s. They both were trying to hang on for a Democratic president. All the justices do this. They try to time their retirements for a president that they can agree with. They try to hang on, but they're too old and they have to retire because of health reasons. And so first Bush gets to replace both of those leading liberal justices. For the first one, he chooses David Souter, who is a sitting federal judge in New Hampshire, who nobody had ever heard of. He had been a federal judge for like less than a year. Before that, he had been a New Hampshire state judge. So it's a little bit like O'Connor, like pretty obscure. People in New Hampshire knew who he was. Like Republican Party officials in New Hampshire were the ones who recommended him. Like they knew who he was. But the goal of the nomination was, this guy's going to be like a stealth conservative. He's got no public record on anything, right? Bork, they dug up all his old writings and they were able to block him. This guy is going to be conservative, but they can't block him because they got no public record to challenge him on. That might have backfired, because Souter turned out not to be that conservative, right? They thought he was a reliable conservative with no public record, but in fact, he was like a New Hampshire Republican, which is really different than like a Mississippi Republican, right? At least back in the 80s. For the second nomination, this is Thurgood Marshall, remember, first and only African-American justice on the court up until that point. George Bush and his advisors are like, oh, we got an idea for this one. We got somebody who is extremely conservative, but he is African-American, and we're going to nominate him to replace Thurgood Marshall. What are they going to do about that? And the Democrats could not figure out what to do, and many of them voted in favor of Clarence Thomas, who has turned out to have an extremely conservative record on the court. Clinton comes in for 8 years and gets 2 vacancies. Right? Again, notice some like randomness. Like Reagan was 8 years and had 3 vacancies. Clinton is 8 years and he only gets 2 vacancies. Why? It's not fair. What's the deal? How's that? So he appoints Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Stephen Breyer. George W. Bush comes in for 8 years. He gets 2 vacancies. He appoints Chief Justice Roberts. For his second vacancy, he nominates Harriet Miers, who's his White House counsel, who winds up withdrawing, partly because some people thought she was not qualified, and partly because some people, Republicans, thought she was not conservative enough. And it's really the only modern example of a Supreme Court nomination getting blocked by the president's own party. It was a Republican Senate at the time, and it was Republicans who demanded that she withdraw her nomination because they thought she wasn't conservative enough. Then Bush nominates Samuel Alito, who's confirmed. Obama comes in. He gets 3 vacancies. He fills 2 of them with Sonia Sotomayor, first Latina justice on the court, and Elena Kagan. And then he nominates Merrick Garland, who is a sitting federal judge on the D.C. Circuit, who is eminently qualified for the Supreme Court. There are multiple Republican senators on record with public statements recommending him to the Obama White House for the previous 2 vacancies. They're like, oh, you should nominate that guy. He's a Democrat, but he's like as a moderate judge, judicial restraint. We're not too worried about him. We go along with him. But this time, that was when you had a Democratic Senate. Now we got a Republican Senate, and so Mitch McConnell says, I'm blocking everybody. Even before Garland is nominated, he says, I don't care who the president nominates, we're not going to consider them. This basically has no precedent of a Senate refusing even to hold hearings on a nominee. They don't reject Garland, they just don't even have a hearing. That's unusual. Trump wins the election. Trump nominates Neil Gorsuch, who is a sitting federal judge from Colorado and is widely perceived as very conservative. The sum total of all of this is, though there have been some Democratic appointees, right, 2 from Obama and 2 from Clinton, over the past generation, like basically during my lifetime, I was born in 1970, during my lifetime, the vast majority of Supreme Court appointments have come from Republican presidents. Republican presidents who are advocating all these kinds of ideas. It would be surprising if the Supreme Court doesn't start shifting in some different directions, and our main focus for the rest of the semester is to see what happens. It would be surprising if the Supreme Court doesn't shift in some ways, And the Supreme Court does shift in some key ways, but maybe it is also surprising that the Supreme Court doesn't shift on everything, right? On some areas of constitutional law, the court makes very sharp turns, and on some other areas, it doesn't. And that's the story that we're going to look at. That's all. Oh, and I've got papers over here for you if you didn't get it.